but welcome everyone. This is the IATI Data Quality Index session. What does good quality data look like? My name is Petya Kangalova. I'm an IATI Senior Business and Data Analyst, and I'm sure I've seen some of you, and hopefully I'll meet some new faces for the session today. I'm also joined by my colleague Amy, who would help me with slides and also facilitate some of the discussions for this session today. For today, we have around 55 minutes and then moving into other sessions, and we'll talk about the development of the IATI Data Quality Index. So before I start with the agenda for this session, you've seen the slide already, but just a reminder that it will be helpful if you just add your name and your organization. And also, if there are any issues or any questions, please do use the chat box. I think that worked very well in the session earlier on responsible transparency. And there's also interpretation in French and Spanish that you can use by following the button that you can see on that screenshot. So hopefully that's all set. And what is the agenda for today? So we have 55 minutes for this session. What I'll go through is what is the IATI Data Quality Index. I hope most of you would have seen already the consultation, but if you haven't, I'll just give a bit of context in order for you to be able to engage in the discussion today. I'll briefly run through the process that we're following for developing the Data Quality Index. And the key focus of this session is very much to go through the feedback that we have received so far. You would hear about comments we have received and discussions. And then we'll have probably around half an hour just to go into discussion into this main room and pick up on some specific questions that we thought would be really good to have this virtual conversation and engagement as opposed to the written comments that we have received and the ones that we have seen on IATI Connect. And then I'll briefly talk about the next steps in this process. So what is the IATI Data Quality Index? Some of you will be familiar that before, the only measure that IATI had for all existing publishers was the IATI publishing statistics. So that was already set during the Busan commitments, and it hasn't been updated for quite some time. So this measure was the only one in existence, and it very much looked at IATI's key qualities, what we call timely, comprehensive, forward-looking data and looking at coverage again. So the aim of the Data Quality Index was very much set in line with the IATI strategic plan and really building a measure and updating a measure that would help with improving data quality and something that would really incentivize publishers. The aim of the index and what we are focusing on this year and with the start of the consultation is to reach that agreement within the IATI community on what good quality IATI data looks like, and that's what we'll be discussing. And doing that by agreeing a set of revised data quality measures for all IATI publishers. And I think that's quite important to hear the views of the different stakeholder groups, as the IATI Data Quality Index will be relevant to all IATI stakeholders. Then the aim is very much, once the agreement and the consultation has happened, is to implement this measure into a new IATI Data Quality Index, so to have a tool that organizations can go and look into. And very much the long-term plan as part of the strategy is to use that index to incentivize publishers to drive up the quality and as well as usability of IATI data. So going into the measures, so when we talk about data quality and the measures, we put together a background paper that was shared with the community on proposed measures for the Data Quality Index. There were two existing areas, and I'll go in a bit more detail. So talking about timeliness, I think that was picked up a lot in different sessions as well yesterday during the workshops, and what we call data completeness. So there were a lot of measures into the comprehensiveness. So what is the availability of data being published? And then we also added 3 new areas. So adding a simple with the launch of the IATI Validator, being able to have those statistics included into the index so that they're all in one single place. data complementarity and trust in data that I think were a bit more challenging to measure, and we'll talk about in this session. It'd be good to hear your feedback on that. So what was the process? Again, I just wanted to flag this again for those of you who might not have been involved. So the consultation and being able to reach our aim and delivery of that, the data quality index, we've proposed a two-phase approach. So we're currently in the first phase when we're looking at those important dimensions of good quality IATI data with relevance to all types of publishers. We have shared a background paper that I know I can already see names of people who have commented on Connect and have read that. We've received comments on IATI Connect since the launch on 1st of September up until October. And now we're having this session, which is an opportunity very much for us to hear from you and have this discussion. And then we'll also have a webinar next week, which will just focus on the data quality index, which will give an opportunity for others who are not able to join today or go in more in depth to other points. So that's happening in September, end of October. And following that, once we have an agreement on the measures, I think we'll go into the very detailed work around working on the technical methodology. So how those measures would look, which elements, and how that will be adapted to the different publisher types, and that will be shared as well with the community. So this is the plan. We're now in the first phase, and then towards the end of the year, we'll be working on the methodology, and within the next year, we will have a data quality index, a place where people can go to. So before I begin, one of the questions, and I'll go into the feedback we've received so far in the presentation, was we've asked people about describing data quality in 5 words as part of the consultations. And those were just some of the words that we picked up from that were currently being added. I don't think we can use one single word, but it gives you an idea of some of the words people use when they think about good quality data. So what we heard so far, as I said, the consultation was open on Connect, and we heard from 13 different organizations. And I think we had a good mix of different representatives in terms of some data users. We heard from the publishers, which was good, from the different types of publishers of bilateral and multilateral, as well as NGOs, and as well as some of the tech providers as well. So that was a good mix. What we heard overall is there was support for what was proposed. There was a clear comment around focusing on active activities. On timeliness, I'll go in detail in a second a bit more about the metrics being proposed, which was again support. I think one of the key areas that we need to continue measuring with some suggested changes. Data availability, as I briefly mentioned, there was a really good suggestion to just change the wording to data completeness. And I'll go through some of the areas for discussion. Overall support for the new validator measure, which is great. And there were quite a few areas where we do need further discussions, and those are ones that we'll focus on today as well, around adapting measures to different groups of publishers, the data complementarity, and the issue around trust and how that can be measured. So some of those further methodological considerations will be required. And that would also happen in the next phase of the consultation. So let's look at the measure. On timeliness, I think everyone did agree on inclusion of frequency and time lag. That's what previously was used in the publishing statistics, and there was an agreement that we do need to keep that measure. Very clear view that closed activity, something we didn't specifically include, need to be excluded from this measure, which does make sense. There were some proposals around the timeliness measure. At the moment, it only looks at updates and transactions. So there were a few comments about specific additional elements, not really an agreement of what those would be. And that would be one that we could discuss as well further in the upcoming webinars. That maybe for some of the updates, there are other elements to be looked at. In terms of the new timeliness measures, there was kind of check on the consistency. So this was one of the new proposed measure. I think what was really good to see in the discussion was about the suggestion on marking active or inactive publishers, so whether they've done updates into their data with specific proposals of what elements we can use for that check. And very much the suggestion to highlight the active ones as opposed to penalizing others. Data completeness. So as you can see on the right side of the slide, there was a long list of different measures that we looked at, and thanks to everyone who's thoroughly reviewed or looked at the paper. But what was quite good to see from the current feedback is that there was an overall support for the new categories being proposed. So as you can see from that list, so there wasn't an area or something that we have completely missed, and the community really wanted to have that included as an important measure. I mentioned the name change, which I think is great, and I think that's what, we'll continue with. Some specific points were raised about making sure there's no duplication of measures. So for instance, around the humanitarian data and what we're measuring under location, and also specifically related to identifiers, which we can take on board. One of the big feedback points that we had was that there was difference in relevance for each metric for different organization types. And that is very true. And that's something that we can discuss a bit later in the session and see how that can be presented in the data quality index. And that was coming very much from whether organizations are in different part of the funding chain, like what they're the type of organization, but also very much the differences between, humanitarian or development organizations. And then we also had support for the measure of coverage, which was something that in IATI has not been updated for quite some time, and using the total expenditure in organization files with some specific additional suggestions on how to compare that, which we can look into and possibly add. And I'll go into the next slide, which will be the final one before we go into discussion and hear from you on those specific measures. So on the new measures, what I briefly mentioned already, there is support to add a validation statistic, which I think will be great to look at the progress of organizations already using the data and improving, fixing or improving their data already, which is something that can be added. And then the other two new measures that were proposed, and I'll briefly speak about what they were included, were around data complementarity and trust. So data complementarity, there were three suggestions that we made. One was about predictability, and there was a bit of support for the specific measure, which was about checking when organizations have added commitments, how that has followed through in terms of spend. The other two areas around data complementarity was around the usefulness of budgets. And that's a question that we did have quite a bit of feedback of the maybe challenges for some organizations with the current proposal about, is it feasible to be adding budgets, forward-looking budgets for the next 3 years in order to be able to understand the usefulness of the data. And the last one was more around funding flows coming in and out of the different organizations. So I think those measures, there was feedback on those, and they do need further discussion in order to be able to come to a methodology of how that will be measured. And the last, but not least, was around trust. And this very much came as a suggestion of something as part of the strategic plan consultation. And I know there was a lot of discussion in the development of the resource framework as an important measure, for data users. Of course, that is something that would be quite difficult to measure, and we had three proposals of how potentially this can be done, and we did get quite a lot of feedback on those ones, that they were quite simple in terms of measuring trust, because they were looking at, for instance, if when organizations have suddenly made their data unavailable, or how quickly organizations would address any quality issues that were raised by users or others. And again, I think there are quite a lot of challenges with those that I can speak a bit more in the discussion session and hear from you on that. I think that's the presentation that I'll stop with. And now we have a few questions that we have prepared, and we'll open the floor for discussion. So the first one, Amy will be facilitating, which is regarding some of the data completeness questions that I briefly picked up on. Over to you, Amy.
Cheers. Thank you, Petya, for taking us through the Data Quality Index so far and some of the discussions that we've been having. And morning, afternoon, evening to all of you online. Thank you for joining. So I'll probably have a chance to go through maybe a couple of these questions. And these have been picked out because we've had quite a lot of debate and discussion on IATI Connect around them to begin with. So if we start off with the adjusting the data quality index measures based on organizations, please do post in the chat, or please do put your hands up in order to come and join in. So one of the things that has come up a lot is that we want to be able to adjust the data quality index so it can be based on the organization type and the role of organization publishing data. Not everyone needs to be publishing the same. Therefore, we shouldn't be judging or categorizing people by the same standard. But there's a question of how do we begin to do that? We have suggested we could look at organization type, or we could look at role that the organization gives themselves in IATI. Do you have any other ideas of what we could use in order to tailor the data quality index to a specific publisher? Give you a moment to think about that. Please do put something in the chat. Please do put your hand up, and we'll give you the floor. Or maybe you think these measures are completely fine as they are and nothing more is needed. Or maybe you don't think they're quite complete, but you don't know what to do about them. Interesting to hear your views either way.
Michelle, Amy has added a comment as I wait to hear from others around the difference between humanitarian and development activities. And I think on this one, Michelle, maybe I'll start, and that can maybe stimulate some of the discussion. I think a lot of the feedback, so on humanitarian and specifically for the activities, there is the data completeness area about humanitarian data, which would be, separated. But what we're trying to understand here is the separation about the role of organizations. And in IATI, there isn't, the type of organizations. When organizations publish, they don't split between, we are humanitarian or development. So that could be an interesting discussion. Like our thinking was very much from the type in terms of we're multilateral or bilateral. Do you want to come in, Michelle, to elaborate on this one?
I think the role more so than the type probably is going to be indicative of what should be included. It baffles me, ODA and including whether something is ODA gets listed as a complete, I think it's part of the comprehensiveness part now, but that's really only relevant for governments that are having to declare to their public that they've put aside the 7% or whatever it is that they've committed to putting in ODA. And oftentimes we get money from governments and they specifically say, do not publish to IATI, this is not ODA. And our response is, we publish everything, whether it's ODA or not. So I do think it's important to make a distinction between the role, it's perhaps a role and the role played, because that will weed out, if I'm not the one giving money, or if I'm not a government giving money, ODA is an irrelevant topic. And to have that trace through the project, the activities is difficult, because again, we don't know whether or not someone's giving us ODA or not. It's not in our contracts that says, by the way, this is ODA. So I would agree that the type and role, or some combination, more so the role than the type. But again, my ODA example does tell you that it should be governments that have to mention that, but not other organizations. And again, I mentioned the humanitarian versus development simply because right now, again, the humanitarian data is kind of an afterthought because, as you pointed out, the dashboard was originally designed long before the humanitarian elements were even in the standard. But being able to turn that on and off, if an act, because for example, again, our organization, we publish both humanitarian and development. And I know the Grand Bargain dashboard, which is looking specifically at humanitarian, is able to weed out and not look at things that's development, but having that integrated in the dashboard would be good, and not just if you're on the Grand Bargain side, because there's a lot of folks that are doing humanitarian work that are not in the Grand Bargain dashboard as well.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And that I suppose the option in order to have those filters built into the dashboard and what they should be is crucial and something that needs to be picked up as we begin to look at the methodology of how we begin to assess this. Yeah. And with humanitarian, it's possible to identify those activities and therefore include only those within a humanitarian section of said dashboard.
Something I would add, and I've mentioned it in the consultations online, but I think it was Johanna that brought it up. I mean, the ability to have almost like an interactive dashboard that allows you to filter through what you need and say what is there when you are a publisher and a government and a whatever it is, would be very helpful. That's a much bigger thing than what we have traditionally had, and I have no idea the complexity of the technical side of that. But as a publisher who is often, and again, I have another consultation out there, who's looking to find, oh, who's the one that's already using this data or has already got that data in there, so I can go look and cheat off of how they've structured their data or referenced it. And it's not just a matter of, it then provides a tool that's not just a matter of completeness, but rather it becomes a tool for publishers or users to know who's got that data where. So it can almost help kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Michelle. And that's, speaking into Stephen's comment. Stephen, do you want to come in? Say more about your chat, about the comment you put into the chat.
Thanks, Amy. Can you hear me?
Sorry. I can hear you.
So thank you. Yeah, it's sort of the publisher stats of the IATI dashboard is really helpful and really interesting. It's been there for many years. But I always end up in conversations with organizations who think that that's the outcome of publishing IATI data, that you need to end up as high as possible on that publisher stats page. So I'd be really interested to know what the community think about that being a healthy indicator for the initiative. I appreciate we have to mark and assess quality in some way or another, but we end up in this reductive process of measuring organizations against each other because the data is presented in a table that you can sort. I think is the rudimentary position. So any wider thoughts on that would be really helpful, and I appreciate it's really difficult, and the consultation has been really welcome and getting some interesting parts. So thank you.
If a comment from Johanna to that there needs to be some level of similarity in which our organizations publishing to IATI are including, but yeah, that there are others that we would not expect certain organizations to may be detrimental for them to be publishing. And how do we capture that in a dashboard so it doesn't become this overarching league table? Johanna, would you like to come in?
Thank you. First of all, what you just read was not from me, actually. That was somebody before me, I think. I posted something else. But that it doesn't matter because people can read the comments anyway. I just wanted to react to what Stephen was just saying, and two things. One is that for better or worse, I do think we need some kind of assessment tool for data quality because we have made commitments, because we are in a world where we need to be able to say, if only for Busan, if only for the GPDC, if only for, we need to be able to measure ourselves, and perhaps that is only in the world of bilateral donors and some of the multilaterals, but like we need to be able to take stock once in a while and say, whether we're making progress or not. And yes, to some extent, and a healthy dose of competition among ourselves. We kind of like to be able to say that, yeah, we're ahead or behind, or no, we don't want to say we're behind, but we're ahead. So in that sense, you know, in the political economy of the development world, it can be useful, and we should not be losing track of that, and it should be on our radar. It remains important for IATI, and I understand it's not important for all 1,300 publishers, and this goes back to, we need to think about the assessment methodology to apply to everyone in terms of the indicators and really think them through. But what Michelle was saying about, do we need a single index, or maybe it is the case that there's going to be variable geometry in how those indicators come together, or maybe there is an index that is really geared towards the Busan or whatever it is now, but that we use, there's a subset of those indicators that we use as the Busan index, or as to respond to those types of big political commitments, and there are more practical assessment tools that are just to provide feedback for publishers to help them understand where some of their weaknesses are in a more kind of constructive feedback. And this is how you assess your progress and whether you're heading in the right direction or not, kind of thing. And maybe that's fine. Maybe we don't need to, in that sense, to use them for everyone all the time. And in that sense, really, let's not lose track of user needs, and let us really inform those conversations with a user perspective. What is useful for the users? And really, a lot of those elements, and I'm not saying they should be removed from the standards, and we're not going to stop publishing them, but I'm not sure that they belong in such an index. Like, they're not the crucial ones for most users. So let's have parsimony in the index as well, if we can. Thank you.
Cheers, thank you, Hannah. And it brings up an interesting point in terms of what data is needed, and what data can help allow data users to find what they are looking for and understand that data. One of the questions coming up is, I don't think we've included in here, but it's like around recipient language. And then we're publishing titles and descriptions in the language of the country that the activity is taking place in. There's been quite a lot of pushback from our publisher community on this, saying it's a lot of effort. It allows for a great deal of ambiguity and maybe mistranslation. And yet it's something that we do get asked quite a lot by the help desk from our users, is going, hey, this is great, I can see the data, but I can't understand it. And where does that burden lie? Does it lie on a translation in a tool? Does it lay with our publishers? Do we take it out of this index? Do we take it out of the current dashboard? Or do we keep it in, knowing that it is a much harder goal for a number of our publishers to aim for?
Just to add, Amy, to Johanna's point, I think it's very much around what is being assessed in this kind of two-phase approach. And then the second one is, once the methodology is there, is also how that's visualized, how is that presented. And I think there was a lot of feedback that, yes, we're not going to build just one long list and one score, but it's all those different assessment areas. And I think that would be the point of how is that presented, and also regarding the user needs. And I think Matt, I'm not sure if he had some quite helpful suggestions as well, I think, from a data use perspective on that. But I think those points are taken on board for the next phase. But yeah, I think overall not an easy task, because there is a lot of different areas to be covered.
This is a good point to move on to the second set of questions, and these are looking particularly at the new measures coming in. So question to you all, what would it take you to begin to trust IATI data? What does it mean to you, and what evidence would you need? Joseph, would you like the floor?
Hi, Amy. I just wanted to respond to the discussion going on between Michelle and Johanna and Stephen in the chat, because I think this is a critical issue. And so like a little bit of the history of where this question came from the results working group was taking the idea of something like ATI, but saying, you know, that has value. So building on what Johanna has been saying, that does have value in incentivizing organizations to improve the quality of their transparency efforts more broadly. And so the question of the results group was like, how can we bring something that's closer to that effort, but to everybody, to all all publishers, essentially. So I think there's a really valuable kind of point about user needs and so on and so forth. But ultimately, I do think it's important to bear in mind the principle of equity, that this should be something that is useful and available to all publishers, right? And it doesn't have to be. I actually think, you know, it's helpful maybe to have a little bit of competition, and like in a, you know, friendly way. We shouldn't forget that it's also useful for advocates inside organizations, because, you know, you can take this information back to your management and say, like, look, this is where we stand vis-a-vis other organizations, and this is, you know, why we need to make particular investments in our transparency infrastructure, or so on and so forth. So just to kind of reinforce that point, I think that the results working group wanted to go beyond what we currently have, which is kind of really focused on the data, and to ask this bigger question, but it has to be available and useful to all publishers. Thanks.
Thank you, Joseph. That's, yeah, it's very good. I wonder if we have anyone else. I think Michelle, I'm not sure if that's a legacy hand or you have any specific feedback, and then I can give a bit more context as well on the trust question to prompt your views, because I think that one was difficult to measure. I think maybe Joseph know from the discussions in the results framework group. But any thoughts, immediate thoughts from anyone?
It's not a legacy hand. It's to add. Yeah, I do agree that healthy competition is good. I mean, Joseph, we all come from the UN. I know my superiors are constantly asking me, how are we doing? How are we doing? The thing is I don't know that giving a score is giving us the quality that we're talking about. For me, I'm okay, and I agree with level setting, but just knowing that the data is out there, who's got that data. For me, the Hum portal has been very helpful. The presentation that was done yesterday, that when you said the tech team looked at various publishers, you know, and seeing all the things that the various publishers, I saw the UN in there, and I'm looking at all my UN counterparts going, okay, to me, that's as meaningful and valuable to get buy-in on what we need to do to improve our data, as it is coming out with a score that's including ODA and things that just aren't ever going to happen for us. So I don't disagree with having healthy competition. I just question whether or not providing a score number is going to get you there, because I do know there are publishers with really good scores, but when you look at their data, it's not such great data. It's just that they've populated a field with something that gives them credit, and it doesn't mean it's valuable or usable data for the users. And I'll end it there. In terms of trust, I've got no immediate thought, so I'll let you clarify all of that first.
Good. Thank you, Michelle. I think to your point, it is the balance. And I think when we talk about score, I think the idea is not to have just one single score in the index, but be able to look at those different areas. And to, I think Joseph's point is to be able to, have a place for all publishers to assess. I think on the point about trust, so that was something that was added, and it was very much coming from the strategic plan of how do we measure trust. And I think our initial proposals that we put forward for that was, for instance, whether organizations have suddenly made a change to their data, or if, let's say, organizations have been contacted with data quality issues, whether those were addressed. I think the feedback we've had so far was, first of all, that trust was something very personal, it was probably not the right word, at least from some people who commented. So one of the suggestions was about data clarity, like to be able to recognize. I think we had some feedback that it will be quite hard to measure. So there was feedback around maybe not doing this at this point in time, like including a specific assessment around trust. And again, I think the feedback was around depending on different organizations. So let's say if organizations, let's say, already have good quality data, and you email them, with specific issues, like they'll be not be penalized for not including them. But I think the overall question is whether that's something that organizations think need to be included, or is that something that's kind of cross-cutting and would come across in terms of how it can be measured, because I think that was a difficult one to really suggest practical ways of measuring.
Sorry,
I think we have. Any suggestions? The silence might either mean that there aren't additional suggestions on the specific measure. Sarah, great to come in.
Sure, fine. Hi, everyone. It's good to chat. I just wanted to come in quickly to say, obviously Stephen and Mark are raising such good comments and thoughts in the chats, and the dashboard that we saw yesterday is, I think, maybe like the next step, and both Stephen had such a huge hand in that as well, so I'm probably not the right person to be recommending this or to bringing this up, but I just really appreciated the dashboard that obviously we have these tools for how well a publisher is doing, but then taking that next step of saying why and what else do we have missing and how else can we improve it. Knowing whether or not to trust the data is good, but that doesn't improve our trust in the data. So step one is saying, okay, this one's doing well or not that well, but then how do we actually improve it? So your question really is, what would it take for you to trust IATI data? To me, that's not about which ones can you trust, but it's really more a question of how do we improve the trust. So I really appreciated that tool that they presented yesterday, that and would love to see more things like that really for example, when you drop down, if you correct the data less, if we're doing less data cleaning, and you use that drop down menu and you can see all of the different ways that people are spelling all of the different publishers, then that becomes a really very apparent and immediate way to improve something. And then as we continue making those and identifying those issues and then following through with improving them, I think it takes steps like that that will lead us to actually have improved trust in the data. Over.
Thank you, Sarah, for this. I think the way that I interpret this is more around the assessment or how progress is done according to those, having a dashboard, something that's being used, as opposed to having a separate measure on trust, if I've interpreted that correctly. Stephen, do you want to come in?
Thank you, and thank you, Sarah. Just a quick point, really. I've been trying to make it in the chat too. I think it's time, and we know this happens, that those that use the data, whether it's in country systems or in external websites and dashboards, say this data is not good enough, we can't use it, and that should be known. I think too often we try and use IATI data and we can't. So our concession with the dashboard that Sarah talked about was to say, okay, we'll show a mirror to you about how it's not useful. But equally also, I think we have to exclude data when it's simply not good enough, and that needs to become known. I think when it can't be used for whatever use case It might be a very obscure use case, but it needs to be known. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm trying to, are you thinking more about how, like in terms of the feedback loops, or how that's presented in the assessment, like being able to represent that in a dashboard?
I think there are a million activities in total in IATI. Some people using the data will not want to use them all. And in some cases, they want to use a good proportion of them, and they simply can't. They're not good enough. They're not timely, or they're not complete enough for their use case. So having a way to know if data is useful for people would be really helpful as a signifier of trust, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, and the challenge is how that can be presented, you know, for the different use cases. I mean, one of the very small suggestions was around this active publishers, but that's just one very small area of assessment. But that's really helpful. So thank you. Thank you also for the discussion already in the chat. Are there any other comments around trust? So one of the, I think, other questions we wanted to bring, and we can open up for any other feedback directly from the group, or anything else that would be helpful for us to to present, so that you're able more easily to engage. So the other question we had was more around the data complementarity, and that was related to budget data. So I think this links a bit to the discussions about the usefulness, about data use, and whether, you know, for a specific, for instance, partner country government, it's important to be able to see this budget data. So we talk about forward-looking budgets, and the proposal was about the next 3 years. And I think we did already have feedback that will be a challenge for some organizations. Trying to read through the chat, and I think there were some comments as well about that. Probably on Johanna, but Mark, I saw you raised your hand first. If you want to come in, I wasn't sure on the first or second question.
Yeah, on the second question, I think this sort of relates a bit to like what we're trying to do with this index, right? And what what we're really trying to achieve. And I think this is a good example where, you know, for bilaterals and multilaterals at the country level, it's incredibly important to have this 3-year forward data for planning purposes, for being able to make good, sensible, strategic decisions as part of the budget process. But it doesn't really matter so much probably for non-official donors, so for NGOs or for the private sector. I think that, you know, also just in terms of the effort of trying to collect that data, right? So I think there might be, and I think it's also relevant to say, you know, this was a specific commitment that bilaterals and multilaterals generally made back in 2008 in Accra, and, you know, previously as well, to provide this forward data. And even if some organizations are not able to provide that right now, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be, you know, still assessed against that and trying to, you know, sort of, I think basically, you know, the index should also be trying to, you know, raise ambition rather than simply reflecting what's currently realizable in terms of different organizations publishing practices as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess there's two things. One, maybe it makes sense to have some differentiation between, I think, bilaterals and multilaterals on the one hand, and maybe other sorts of organizations in terms of what's really important to be published. While recognizing that can be, you know, challenging to maintain sort of different indexes at once. And secondly, that we should make sure this index is ambitious and that it's actually pushing publishers to make sure they're publishing good quality data that's going to be usable at the country level. And I definitely think I really think there is a piece of work to be done still in this, of going back and reflecting on, you know, what are the essential pieces of data that users really need, and to what extent are we, you know, is the index kind of pushing, incentivizing, helping benchmark, etc., organizations to kind of begin to, you know, to publish data according to what's needed.
Thank you, Mark. Johanna, I saw you had also a comment in the chat specifically around this from the publisher perspective. Do you want to come in around on the budget point or something else that you wanted to come into?
It wasn't something else, but just actually to reiterate, the no amount of pressure on us will change the reality that Parliament gives us our budget, and we can publish. It counts as 2 or 3 years ahead, depending on when exactly you assess. So, like, we put out the data that we have, that Parliament gives us, and that's the end of it. And and that's not going to change unless Canadian legislation changes. And so it's what it is. And so some years maybe will count as having published 3 years, and some years will count as having published 2 years. And our score may change, but our practice won't. So I don't know. I don't know. The value of the score, therefore, may actually undermine the credibility of that particular measure, because our score may change. And that's just one example. I'm just pointing out that if the practice doesn't change, but the score changes, then it points to something wrong with the indicator. But anyway, and I do realize, however, the importance of having that information. It's just that there's nothing we can do about it. What I actually wanted to say was that those questions could be somewhat linked. I'm wondering if we could focus the trust question, rather than making it a really broad question about whether users in general trust the IATI data, and trying to think of a way to assess that, really focus it much more narrowly on partner country governments, and perhaps rather than asking them whether they trust it, actually looking at their practice, and do they show that they trust it by using it, kind of thing. And people like Mark could actually be of great help in that. Are they using it? Are they, and therefore coming to the second question as well, to some extent, where donors at the country level sharing or not sharing information about their forward plans, and getting into that discussion with partner country governments about their plans and about the quality of their data. You get into that conversation about the credibility and the quality of their data, and over time, hopefully can improve it. And so there could be something there about whether or not the information is accessible, whether it is trustworthy, whether it gets used. And maybe we could think of a way to assess that and look at that at the country level, rather than making it a much broader measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. I think there was actually some comments specifically about how the data can be used by other applications, whether it's being used specifically. I think Herman added on that, and I think that links. But I think from what I've heard so far, it is difficult. So we can't just add a measure of trust, but I think of those, and I think that's a practical suggestion, Johanna, of how, whether the data is being used, how we'll be able to include it. I think that would be a challenge, but at least I think there are some roots in terms of thinking of ways of measuring it, and not just calling it trust, but looking at usability with others. I'll just open for any final comments on those two questions, and then I can see that there has been, and thank you, Sarah and Amy, for responding to some of the chats already, which has been really useful, and that's something we can take on board as well, in addition to the feedback received on Connect. But are there any final thoughts or comments from anyone before we move on to the next slide, just to think around next steps and how we move on? I think it is right. It is an ambitious plan, but I think it's good to hear from the group that there is a sense of it's something that is needed. And I think we have to do our best in terms of looking into how that methodology can be set up. Hi, Mark. Do you want to come in with any final comments?
Yeah, just picking up one on what Johanna said. I mean, I think, yeah, like a good way of assessing this is basically really asking, is this, not only do people kind of trust the data in some sort of vague or general sense, but do they actually use it, right? So and is the data for a particular publisher, is the IATI data actually being used in different countries? And if it is, then that obviously indicates a high degree of trust. And if it's not, then it's just not. Obviously, there can be different reasons, and lots of reasons why IATI data is not used in different countries. But in any case, I think this would create some very positive incentives, both for publishers to more actively engage, I guess, and work with their partner country counterparts also to make sure the data is being used and to understand the reasons why it's not, and what might need to be adjusted and changed.
That Mark. Okay, thanks to those of you who brought thoughts and views on this. I think if we go into the next slide, which is talking about next steps. Next steps, we have another webinar next week, next Wednesday, which is again looking at the Data Quality Index and giving an opportunity for others to join as well. And I think there was some really good feedback in this session and things that we can reflect on and see how we can incorporate into the next phase. Feel free to have a look. I think that was shared as well in the chat box on the current consultation thread. There have been a lot of comments, and we've tried to summarize those at the start of each consultation topic. And of course, I think if there are any questions, you can always send us an email or get in touch on this. So thanks, everyone. I think we have the next sessions, which I can update you on, and then you have a few minutes before the next session starts. So you can stay in this room for the IATI Unified Platform and Microservices Future Begins, or move into room 2 or 3 for the other 2 sessions that you can see already in the slide. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the community exchange.
Thank you.
Thank you.